of America, the American pie, is quickly diminishing, and I feel the leadership in this country selecting people like Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, to make our CIA, German Henry Kissinger, and Polish German Mr. Brzezinski to make our foreign policy decisions, are taking America away from Americans and leading us to a destructive World War III. I'm going to be making a separate tape, just a biographical tape for people who listen to these shows on radio stations or who have not subscribed for a long, long time, as an introductory starter tape, so that if they begin subscribing, they have this first tape as a way of introduction, and it will explain my political views, where I stand, right, left, or middle, what I think of the various candidates, my overview of history, where I think we got into trouble, and where the leaders are taking us now, and how the categories of the information I put on the tape each week fit into that overview. I get a lot of letters and requests for different pieces of information that I don't want to cover each week on the tape. And if there's one, what I call a starter tape as a background, or if you have lost track of what it was that I was driving at in bringing up certain information, you can get the starter tape and get your background on that tape. And then I won't have to answer so many letters, and you will have it, because my overview of history, where I think we got into trouble and where we're going, hasn't changed one iota in 16 years. The more I study, the more it confirms my worst fears, and the newspapers seem to support those kinds of fears, and the only way to untangle this mess we're in is to continuously study the roots of how we got there. You have to take the daily newspaper articles and then relate them to the past events and realize that there's this continuous line of cause and effect that I keep saying isn't coincidental, that I believe it is arranged by conspirators to manipulate us to a specific place and goal that they want us to arrive at. The past 3 weeks I've been talking about the arrests of Mr. Terpil and Mr. Korkola at the Hilton Hotel in New York City, December 24th. It isn't hard to update you on the news of these arrests because there's so little in the news, but for our tapes, this is part 4, to continue with that series. Last week on the tape, I talked about the gun-running suspects who were tied to British dealers and mentioned Mr. Samuel Cummings, who lives in London, who supplies weapons for gun runners, international gun runners, who supply the so-called Third World of Libya, Idi Amin, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Mr. Gaddafi. And the purpose of emphasizing the importance of the arrests in New York is to show that the men arrested have links to international terrorism that looks like it's left to Third World, but which is directly linked to the Central Intelligence Agency and counterintelligence and firms in the United States and dummy fronts with banks all over the world that are actually supplying these weapons, so that at the time that we do go to war against the Soviet Union, all of a sudden the Third World that would align itself with Russia will be voting and going against the Soviet Union. It will be heavily armed and will in turn turn down all their own people, not raise their standard of living, but become weapons merchants, gun runners, and narcotic dealers, pumped by the Nazi mafia with funds which started originally after World War II, taken to Argentina and then to Swiss banks. That's a big lot to swallow if you haven't followed these patterns, but the only way I say is you'll have to follow with the back tapes and keep reading the newspapers. Last week I quoted an article from January 17th, New York Times. 2 days later, there was an article in the New York Times on Mr. Samuel Cummings, the arms dealer, called The Private World of an International Arms Dealer, and it tells how Mr. Cummings lived in Philadelphia. I mentioned that last week, born in the main line in Philadelphia in 1927, born to early first-generation Americans of English-Irish descent. He went into the Army, and then on a GI Bill, he went to George Washington University, where he got a degree in political science, and worked for the Central Intelligence Agency from 1950 until he went to England and opened up this store for weapons, and he's kept up his CIA contacts. The New York Times said they were useful for his gun running. He set up a Delaware corporation, listed himself as vice president. He started selling weapons to the Panama National Guard, and then he went to California and sold some weapons, and Nicaragua, Costa Rica, into Central America, and then he went to Europe in 1957. And 1957 is a most important date. I'm going into it later in terms of the Appalachian meeting, organized crime and the Central Intelligence Agency. They were meeting in New York and setting up their base of operation across the United States. In Europe and Italy, the Mafia were reorganizing in 1957, and they were working with the CIA, Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the organized crime were linked closely together ever since World War II, and were going to combine their muscles starting in 1957, a very important year. And that's the year that the CIA agent Samuel Cummings from the main line of Philadelphia, having pumped his guns in Costa Rica, Panama, California, and so forth, went to London and opened up his shop. And he now has a small arms factory, the New York Times described. He keeps 120,000 square foot office in Alexandria, Virginia. He has another weapons factory near Warrington, Virginia, with sporting arms. And then in England, he has what they call a red brick fortress outfitted with elaborate security, and inside he has this is the New York Times article, 22.5 million inventory of 200,000 small arms waiting to be sold, and in another building in Manchester, England, he has 40 million rounds of ammunition. This is a lot of ammunition. He admits that he worked and supplied weapons to Batista in Cuba before Castro came into power. That's when Frank Sturgis, who was involved with the John Kennedy assassination, was arrested at the Watergate Hotel, worked with the CIA, was running the gaming tables in Cuba. The links of the CIA with the anti-Castro Cubans, with these gun runners and organized crime, is a ball of wax which is being silenced by the Associated Press, United Press, Washington Post, and the only article I got last week was from the New York Times on the 22.5 million inventory of weapons, the 40 million rounds of ammunition, the fact that this was an establishment person from the main line in Philadelphia, first-generation family, early Americans, worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, attended George Washington University, and as I say, has pumped his weapons into Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, has warehouses in the United States, in Virginia, and a massive supply in England. This is the man that supplies the guns for Mr. Terpil and Korkola, who in turn have safe houses for murders, assassins, assassination teams. We won't repeat or go back again on these. If you have the past tapes, if not, you can get them, and I will keep you informed each week on any news that I can get on this story, and if you have any, send it to me. On tape number 425, that's January 25th, this last week, I closed the tape with asking the question, who is William Taub? And I mentioned a book, Forces of Power, by William Taub. That is available. I talked to Tom Davis at Research, and the address is on the slip that goes with the tapes if you want it. William Taub, Grosset and Dunlap, published in New York in 1979, Forces of Power. This is an amazing book for what it tells and also for what it leaves out. But I would want to bring out a few points that are in that book and tie them together with some other information I want to share this week. Among things, Taub was the lawyer for General Trujillo's daughters. He ran the Dominican Republic. It was the president of the Dominican Republic, General Trujillo, and he was murdered by two men from the Central Intelligence Agency, and William Taub said one of them was John Rosselli, part of the Robert Mayhew CIA assassination teams under the cloak of the Hughes organization. Later, Mr. Taub represented one of the daughters trying to get back money from the father's estate that the brothers had taken overseas to Madrid, and Taub was the lawyer for one daughter, and Richard Nixon was the lawyer for the other daughter. He got over $1 million fee to represent the daughter of Trujillo when Nixon was working with the same assassination teams that murdered Trujillo. In October of last year, October the 5th, 1979, on tape 409, I briefly mentioned the Vatican and the Pope having the largest, most powerful voice in the world. This is Pope Paul VI had a radio transmitter put in, and the tower surpassed Iran's outlet, the most powerful shortwave radio station. This came from the San Francisco Chronicle article in 1976 about this radio station, and I mentioned it in 1979. In Mr. Taub's book, he talks about Howard Hughes, how he was linked to business interests called Teleprompter, and they had a large contract in Brooklyn. It was a closed-circuit educational program that they were working on. and he thought the Vatican would be interested in this closed-circuit educational material, and he wanted to pioneer the communication system based on microwave linkage. Now, this is interesting that the first story of this tower broke in 76 because after 1966 there was no use. There was just the CIA and the Mafia combined. So really what the CIA was doing under the guise of the Howard Hughes Empire, just like the assassination teams were done under the guise of the Howard Hughes Empire, they built for the Vatican what they called a communication system based on microwave linkage. And the purpose was to avoid normal communication methods, that they were going to be under the supervision of federal communication systems, and that if the Vatican and the CIA, which is the federal government, could avoid any conflict with the federal communications, they could have any messages they want by beaming them from satellite, put them in orbit for this purpose. And this was considered a breakthrough for the Vatican in communications. And Robert Mayu, the same man who set up the assassination teams for the CIA and organized crime, had a meeting with Mr. Taub, the man who wrote the book Forces of Power, and he describes, it's on page 72, it would be a real coup for the Vatican to have the newest communication. The satellite would be launched from Vatican soil, and then in quotes, the FCC wouldn't have a damn thing to do with it, and the used technical experts could work with it. So William Taub went directly to the Pope because they said you don't have any kind of censorship problems. You can do anything you want. You'll be linked directly around the world. And there's a side remark in William Taub's book. He says, when the idea came through of this Howard Hughes, Robert Mayu, CIA satellite to put on Vatican soil to have complete freedom of communication without interruption of the normal channels or anybody picking the messages up. Mr. Taub writes, when this idea came through, the Pope was dead. The Pope John the 23rd was an amazing man. He died just months before John Kennedy was killed, 5 months before John Kennedy was killed. There's a book by Norman Cousins, The Improbable Triumvirate, on John Kennedy, Pope John the 23rd, and Khrushchev, and the desire for world peace, the signing of the nuclear test ban treaty in the atmosphere, d'entente, which is the thing that the three men lived for and wanted peace. At the time in 63 when these men died, out of the three died, then Giovanni Battista Montini became Pope Paul VI. And it's Pope Paul VI that worked with Robert Mayu and Howard Hughes, and he also is that famous secretary of the Vatican that I keep referring to, who wrote the passport for Martin Bormann and other Nazis to begin a world Nazi organization down in South America. So the project, according to Mr. Taub, getting back to the radio antenna, had political overtones. He said it involved the Central Intelligence Agency, that the Vatican at the time, he says in his book, was not interested, and as a end of section on the Vatican communication system between Howard Hughes and the CIA, he assumes or passes over that this is something that was wanted but didn't go through. But whether he knows it didn't go through or whether he's just saying that to cover it up, it's ridiculous to write it at this time, because in 1976 it was in the newspapers and it was already exposed as a fait accompli that Montini, Pope Paul VI, had put through the communication system. He also says, William Taub, in his book on page 75, that he saw Howard Hughes in 1966 at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and that he never did see Howard Hughes again. He doesn't ask where he is or anything about him, but he reveals the fact that Howard Hughes was escorted by the Central Intelligence Agency to Massachusetts General Hospital. And many of you are familiar with my article about Howard Hughes disappearing from the Boston hospital and being taken to a Greek island by Onassis, and then the CIA took over the entire Hughes organization and moved west to Las Vegas to take over the entire heart of organized crime in 1966, the skimming money and the mafia money, and combined our intelligence agencies with the organized crime connections. I'm going to refer to that later based on some other information that has come in. But Mr. Taub brings up the fact that Hughes was taken to Boston by the Central Intelligence Agency, and he also states that Johnny Rosselli, the same man who was killed right after he testified at the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who he names as being part of the CIA team with Mae, who killed General Trujillo down in Dominican Republic. He says that John Rosselli and the CIA escorted this man known as Howard Hughes on a train to Boston, and then he never saw Hughes again. At least he's honest about that. He also says in his book, these names surface over and over again, he says, like tentacles of an octopus. And he talks about the Vatican wanting to use the CIA and the satellite communications with their link-up anywhere in the world, and mentions what a grim thought. After Taub went to the Vatican to see the Pope about the Howard Hughes CIA organized crime connections, because they keep appearing over and over in articles that are coming out recently, and I'm going to swing to an article in the Village Voice this last week on the organized crime Vatican-CIA connections. Mr. Taub, in the book Forces of Power, says the project of the CIA satellites and communications with the underworld all became linked together. And when he got home from his trip to Rome, a gentleman called him on the telephone to see how the communication idea went, and the man was Richard Nixon. And again, Richard Nixon had called him on the Trujillo affair. The lawyer representing the Trujillo daughter, and then Nixon called, well, how did your trip go to Rome with the satellite, CIA satellite? And Taub said, well, why are you calling me? What do you care? And Nixon said, I'm the counsel for the satellite project for Howard Hughes. Now, Howard Hughes' name has always been linked to one of the first persons that handpicked Richard Nixon to be the front for their organization for, in quotes, the security of the United States, which is the umbrella for a lot of the mischief that we've gotten into in the past years through the entire Cold War period, and then the war in Vietnam, and getting ready for the war in the Middle East. Richard Nixon said, I'm counsel on the satellite project for Howard Hughes. Nixon had funds that came from Madame Chenault. He talks about in the book he had cash funds from the Shah of Iran. He was the daughter, representing the daughter of Trujillo, a multimillionaire, and then Nixon shows up as the attorney for Howard Hughes on the Vatican-CIA satellite system. I thought that was interesting. He keeps bringing back these connecting themes in the book that I stress so much. The CIA, the Vatican, the network for the Nazi resurgence, the funding, and the organized crime connections that weave in and out. And if you get those cast of characters straight, it gets less confusing as news stories break or you read books in the past, because there is this strong connection of these various tentacles which are intertwined but which we never thought of. No one thought of the Vatican as being part of CIA or the Vatican as being part of organized crime. It may have been whispered in certain sections of cities from time to time, but now I see it in the newspaper quite frequently. As the Michele Sindona case comes out in New York, there's constant references to Sindona, the CIA, Sindona, organized crime, Sindona, and the Vatican. Richard Nixon wanted William Taub to work on the Finance Committee for his re-election when he was running for President of the United States. And Taub writes that he was asked to be on this committee. He knew of Taub's work for Eastern oil-producing countries, particularly Iran, and Nixon knew that he helped the Shah of Iran in a dispute with England during the Truman era. That means when they were taking Iran into the American cloak and taking it away from British petroleum. And he said Nixon wanted to obtain sizable, unmarked cash contributions from Mideast sources. He said Nixon had a preoccupation with untraceable cash donations. We found out a little bit of that at Watergate, but of course most of this was hushed up. There was another item in the book, Forces of Power, that I want to call attention to, which is dear to my heart. He tells how he wanted to go to North Vietnam to work with the trade unions and take Jimmy Hoffa there in preparation to end the war, and how he had agreements as a middleman. This Taub has been very important circles from the White House of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, various presidents, and then working with organized crime and labor leaders, and they had an idea of stopping the war in North Vietnam, and all of a sudden he learned that Henry Kissinger really didn't want the war ended, and it came as a blow to him that they were prolonging this war. He accuses them of prolonging the war, that they didn't want it to end. And on page 184 of Forces of Power, he says after that bombshell of learning some more about Kissinger's behavior with Hoffa, Fitzsimmons, and the Vietnam confrontations, he said, I learned Kissinger's meeting with Le Duc Taub had been arranged to destroy everything I had done. Kissinger, whom Le Duc Taub had warned me, was a Nazi. I keep wanting to bring that up because here's the leader of the North Vietnam working with the Soviet Union at that time and had information that Kissinger was actually a Nazi. And I think except for Conspiracy Digest that I wrote for Peter McAlpine on Henry Kissinger being a Nazi, I haven't seen it in any other book. This is the first time that I've seen it printed in a book. And of course, Forces of Power by William Taub has so many other things that go along with the research that I've done that my eyes called attention to this fact, because you're going to see more and more of that years to come when the real truth comes out about the Kissinger family. One more interesting item in the book Forces of Power by William Taub was that he went to Hollywood to work on a movie about the Rothschild family, and he moved from his New York apartment, and he had two paintings there, one a Thomas Gainsborough, and the other was a still life by Rubens. And when he moved to California, the Rubens was missing. Now, this man is no slouch. He carries some pretty fancy artwork around. And when he went to the insurance company to claim the loss, which must have been tremendous for an original Rubens, it was hard to trace it because it was a gift from the Vatican. Now, Taub had been there making the connections with the CIA and Howard Hughes organization and mafia for this great communication systems, and the purpose of giving him a picture, what he says, is that he helped set up free films for a boys' orphanage in Rome at one time. So the Vatican gave him, when Cardinal Spellman was visited by Cardinal Ottaviani in New York City, they brought two pictures for him, a Rubens and a Gainsborough, which were a gift from the Vatican. And I go back again to that book that I have had on the other tapes on the Bormann receipt, how Goering and the Nazis collected valuable artwork from all over the world and dispersed it. Now it's in German embassies, and it's almost impossible for the families to obtain, those that were killed in the concentration camps. So I wonder how much artwork the Vatican got in exchange for allowing Bormann to have passports, or how they accumulated these paintings and how many people they give these gifts out to. William Taub must be a very important person, and he had to authenticate his gift because they had handed him a famous painting by Rubens, The Bowl of Fruit. And wouldn't you like to know who owned that painting originally, where it came from, and trace that painting and how it got in the hands of the Vatican? Again, the Bormann, Nazi, Hughes, CIA, always going back. These artworks will appear and reappear in books. This book is filled with a lot of little goodies, such as his having a Rubens and a Gainsborough as gifts from the Vatican. And it's really hard to believe that William Taub got those for setting up movies at an orphanage in Rome. I read a while back that certain corporations wanted to launch private satellites, such as this that the Vatican had set up with the CIA, so that they don't have to travel around, people don't have to leave home, and they have closed circuit only between each other so that nobody can tap the lines and know what's going on. Just recently, the RCA had a huge communication satellite that, in quotes, got lost. It was launched by NASA, and it's out in there some space. They can't account for it. I wonder if the launching of that satellite at taxpayers' money isn't actually a worldwide communication network system between, say, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, or Interpol, to keep track of people and document it through the data banks to locate people, and that this RCA satellite is, in fact, operating, but they said it's lost in space, and so that the massive thing could be launched, but they don't have to explain what it was because it's not visible anymore on the monitoring screen, and there's no accountability for it where it went. This may be just one more communication satellite that telephone operators will have to listen to while these people go about their messy business. Forces of Power by William Taub also mentions that he brought the black singer Josephine Baker to Las Vegas. He calls it Teamsters pension fund operation known as Syndicate City. He described Vegas in 1952, that far back, as part of Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, John Rosselli organization before the CIA and the Hughes moved in, and Robert Mayu combined with Rosselli and that team. And he tells about taking Josephine Baker out there to sing in Syndicate City and the problems he had with the press and the media, because Josephine Baker was against the Nazis during World War II, and she was the target of a lot of hatred. She worked with the French resistance. She had been honored by Charles de Gaulle, the same person that Permandex had tried to murder. They were unsuccessful there, but they did murder the Kennedy brothers and a lot of other people, this under the cloak of Permandex. But she had trouble in the United States because of the Hearst Syndicate, because of her activities against the Nazis. And in this book, William Taub just hints at how pro-Nazi Randolph Hearst was. He was very pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler, Mussolini, and the fact that a woman, a singer, entertainer, fought the Nazis during the last war and then wanted to come to America, he had trouble getting press releases or reviews or acceptance of Josephine Baker. For one reason, she was a woman, the other, she was black. But the points that he brings out, the real target of hatred was that she worked with the French resistance to get rid of the Nazis, and that the Hearst press would give her, and did give her, so much trouble in the United States. I mentioned last week on the tape the account of William Taub of how he was left for dead. They thought he was murdered, how the American government wouldn't come and help him at any of the hospitals in Europe or in France and Switzerland, and how he recuperated from a murder attempt. But you can see why somebody would take him on a dark road in Switzerland and dump this guy, knowing what he did about Richard Nixon and the Trujillo murder and the Central Intelligence Agency's organized crime and the Vatican connections and their satellites, and with the Kissinger Nazi connections and the Vatican handing out Rubens and oil paintings as gifts to these type of people. Taub claims he was on the White House tapes because he was in the office with Richard Nixon. He says those tapes had to be destroyed or missing. When the Supreme Court said that Nixon should turn over 9 tapes, he held back 9 tapes, and when they said he should produce them as evidence in the Watergate case, then they said, oh, we're sorry, we only have 7. So 2 entire tapes are gone. Out of those, chunks and pieces are missing, and Taub claims that their conversations about Jimmy Hoffa and various shenanigans that he was involved in took place in the White House and would never be heard because they would have to be eliminated. And as I say, they tried to eliminate him. This is obviously a very important man that wove in and out with members of the CIA, the Vatican, presidents, the White House, the entire echelon of society, making the wheeling, the dealing, and always rubbing against the Hughes forces, Richard Nixon, and certain people that he has centered on that he knew. There are many more in the cast of characters, but he's talking about the people he knew. And I'm sure that once he survived that near death, he decided to tell part of the story, not the whole story, but part of the story, because he could blackmail them to not kill him or try to kill him again by holding back some information but letting them know how much he had. Forces of Power by William Taub, an important book if you study current history or American history going back to the period after World War II. On the other side of this tape, we're going right to an expose of the Vatican and Mr. Sindona, whose trial begins in New York City, just began this last week. Again, a news blackout, blacked out by Afghanistan and Iran and other matters, but which is terribly important. I'll go into that now on the other side of this tape with you. It's from a Village Voice article called Chapter from the Godfather by Brian Rostron. You wonder if I'm going to mention at all on this side of the tape the problems in Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, the hostages, Middle East. No, I'm not. They are in the news. A lot of this has been covered. I'm getting good articles on the area. It's certainly timely. But while the news is being covered up with a lot of those subjects, and Pakistan being armed, or whether they get 400 million or 2 billion, or whether we have the Olympic Games or we don't have the Olympic Games, I want to stick to certain articles that are being lost in the news right now, that are being buried, that pertain to all the past research that I've done and that I think are equally as important. The manipulative process of the Middle East I will update maybe next week or the week after. But I do want to get into this article from the Village Voice that was sent to me this last week, titled, as I say, Chapter from the Godfather. If you can get the Village Voice or order the entire article, January the 21st, 1980. I have done many tapes, past tapes, those of you that have the list, on the Vatican, and particularly last November, the series from a book, The Final Conclave, on the financial investments of the Vatican. I did a whole series when the Pope, this Pope, John Paul II, came in, his connections to Auschwitz, to I.G. Farben, to the Bilderbergers, to Prince Bernhard, Royal Dutch Shell. A very important Pope, and the Vatican is an important link for many, many reasons from the end of World War I up to the present. So information that comes out in these trials, the connecting links of the Vatican to the American corporations, is terribly important to keep in the news and not lose sight of the international bankers and the manipulations through the Vatican. This article has to do with the trial that is coming up in New York City. It's going on right now. Again, as I say, a news blackout. There's nothing out here of that infamous Michele Sindona, the gentleman who disappeared last year and then reappeared after the Pope left. He went into hiding when the Pope came to the United States, even though he has the strongest links to the financial empire and the visiting Pope. But he was off the scene. The Pope came to the United States, and then Sindona reappeared. The article begins by telling of the death, July the 11th, 1979, of Giorgio Rosselli from Milan, a lawyer appointed to liquidate a bank that Sindona was in charge of that collapsed. And he had just come from testifying for 3 days with U.S. officials about Mr. Sindona. As the Village Voice said, he was the one man who would know about the financial complicities, the international connections, and the political compromises of the Vatican with the United States corporations. There's another death in Italy, a publisher in Milan who had stock in Banca Unione. I'll give you the spelling on the paper sheets because I don't know if I pronounced them correctly. His name is Mr. Feltrinelli, and he had invested along with the Vatican and suddenly died mysteriously. And this article says the Vatican was grateful to be relieved of this acutely embarrassing association with this millionaire who exploded at the time of investigating as a publisher some of the affairs that were going on. Another man that was killed at the time of these Vatican exposés, they've been going on for quite a while, is Aldo Murro. And way back, I think it was on tape 362, I quoted from George Seldy's book, Never Tire of Protesting, the fact that Premier Aldo Murro in Italy was working with the socialists and had demanded the Vatican itemize their stocks and bonds. The trial of Sindona has to do with the Vatican's mass holdings, and at the time that there was pressure on them to pay taxes in Italy, so they decided to take a lot of the investments out of there and take the money and put it in other corporations. And as some of them began to fail, he was taking it from various banks and siphoning it back and forth and using up this money as they were losing money, draining these banks in Europe and in the United States. And he had been given the job to make the investments for the Vatican. So Aldo Murro was dead, and Mr. Feltrinelli, and there were other deaths involved in this investigation. They keep going on. Jack Bagan, in 1972, working for ABC Broadcasting, was writing articles about the Franklin National Bank and showing hot dollars, which were mobster dollars that got into legal investment channels, the organized crime and the Vatican connections. And he got a telephone call, Bagan, that if you shut up or you'll join along with DeMario. DeMario, the journalist, had been killed doing these investigating stories, and he was threatened. Jack Bagan was taken to the United States and given a tour of various cities, was kidnapped, and then was returned back safely and evidently discontinued the investigations. But then there was another witness, Angelo Serino, who was shot to death, mafia style, and he's the man who had gone to Newsman Bagan with the story that Luciano, of organized crime, one of the mobsters from Italy, had worked with Sindona, who worked with the mobsters in the United States and Europe and with the Vatican banks. He was killed. There have been judges and other people in Milan and newspaper reporters. I have a list of the various Vatican-related deaths. Maybe we'll do just one tape on that. But this article brings out 3 or 4 of them. Just in this article is last January, just last week. Now, Sindona is wanted on 99-count indictment. This is the trial that's going on where the witnesses are being wiped out, charged with bribery, perjury, falsifying bank records, fraud, embezzlement, and so forth. The Franklin National Bank went under $45 million, which was, quotes, misapplied. And the important thing of this missing $45 million is, did it also go into right-wing organizations, what we call missing robberies at airports and so forth? How much of this is going to fund right-wing organizations? I mentioned briefly a few weeks ago, and I want to do a little more on that train robbery in England linked to Otto Skorzeny and the International Odessa Nazi network. There was an article in the Washington Post last week, airline robbed of $2.2 million in Rome. These thieves that are doing these so-called daring robberies, this was a Swiss Air DC-9 plane, are not caught. The money can be used for guns, narcotics, and the police are in collusion and don't manage to ever find these great thieves. The largest burglary or robbery that ever took place was that Lufthansa airplane in New York City at Kennedy Airport. I also want to do tapes on that. But getting back to the Sindona article, he had misapplied, in quotes, $45 million. Sindona's trial was supposed to begin this last September 1979, and Rosselli was murdered July the 11th. The man who had this information for him on crime and the Vatican, the connecting links, and then Sindona disappeared. They tried to blame the leftists for his disappearance. They tried to make it look as if his life would be in danger if he goes to Europe for trials. But the article gives various motives of why he was kidnapped. One, the mafia wanted to keep him from blabbing, and the other is to find out where their funds are. That's a good question, because always the missing funds, millions and millions of dollars, they're not accountable, and the worst he'll get is 1 or 2 or 3 years, and the fund has gone to, and quote, the cause. This article of The Voice says that Milan now is in a psychological state of siege, and I believe it is, because Sindona played a leading role, according to this author, in the misuse of power. The 30-year arrogant misuse of power that is coming to a head in Italy as well as in other countries, such as the Shah of Iran and Somoza, and these various figures are now wearing bulletproof clothes and so forth. And the links, not only of their taking the money and wealth from these individual nations and citizens, but their links to organized crime and the Central Intelligence Agency is surfacing individually in each of these different countries, and it's happening in Italy right now. The article tells the background of Sindona. He went to the University of Messina. He was in Sicily in 1943 when it was invaded by the Allies, and he started to use Allied trucks to haul grain back and forth. And this was his early association with the mafia in Sicily, and that was Lucky Luciano's home base. And then when the United States government came there and the OSS, they later incorporated these men into the Central Intelligence Agency. And as soon as the war was over, the mafia, organized crime, was in business and was incorporated with the United States Army. And they were on their way to taking power throughout the whole world and working their way up through Justice Department, police departments, even the Supreme Court. This article tells how Sindona went with a letter from the bishop of his hometown in Sicily, the Bishop of Messina, and was recommended to Milan. He moved there in 1947. 47 and 57 are very important years. 47 was when the National Security Council was formed in the United States, patterned after Hitler's Gestapo. That was the year that very important congressmen, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, and George Smathers, and the whole Cold War group were put in by various corporations and the Hughes organizations and the military from around the country, and would vote gung-ho on every CIA adventure. They never put, I think there's been 47 bills in Congress to curb the CIA. They've always been turned down, and now they're more powerful than ever. 47 was an important year because he went to Milan, and later that Milan Mafia, again, the Montini story that's written in the Final Conclave and the Bormann Brotherhood and many books that I have. The Milan Mafia was the headquarters of Montini, the Secretary of the Vatican, who later went to be the Pope. When Pope John the 23rd died in 63, he became the Pope, part of this Milan Mafia. And it was in 47 when Sindona went there with Montini's that was his headquarters there, and they were to be working together very shortly. In 1959, Sindona gained control of a bank, Privata Finanziaria, again, not pronounced correctly, I'm sure. Then he got another bank, Banca de Messina, in his hometown. By 1960, he had owned more than one bank, and he was setting up an international network, which he called Basis for Peace. Now, this international ambition, or an international network for peace, has become sort of a code word, like when the Russians no longer exist. Once we conquer the Russians, we'll have peace. It's like Richard Nixon referring on the White House tapes always to going back to the Bay of Pigs, which seems for the researchers to mean the Kennedy assassination. He set up, through his banking shenanigans, from Sicily to Milan, and later with the Pope and the Vatican, what he called his network, international network of peace. Sindona wasn't just going to stay in Milan and be an Italian. He bought a bank in Geneva, the Fina Bank, and that's where he begins to set up his connections with the Vatican. The Vatican had 20% share in Fina Bank. Then he bought a company in Liechtenstein. He had chemical works, and then he went on to convert other financial paradises and set up offices and headquarters. In this newspaper article, Village Voice mentions some, and I have his connections in other places. Sindona was then setting up headquarters in Luxembourg, Panama, Cayman Islands, Liberia, and had deals with German companies in the United States, Canada, France, Spain, Mexico, in the Bahamas. He had linked to 146 companies or corporations by the end of the 1960s. After John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King were killed, Richard Nixon was in office in 1968. Sindona linked with 146 companies, sat on 16 board of directors, and had important connections to Swiss banks and Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, those connections. Now, this article on The Godfather in the Village Voice, chapter from The Godfather, asked the question, who was Michele Sindona? Where did he get all this money from? And I've been stressing on the past weeks the tapes, the millions and millions of dollars taken from Bormann and Montini's passport down to Argentina into the Swiss banks, that once Eva Peron was dead in 1952, the resurgence of these people that could use the Nazi money from World War II that begins to surface. And he asked the question, where does Sindona get his money from? And then he partly answers that there were rumors or talk that there were Howard Hughes connections, rumors that he was connected with Howard Hughes, a front for Howard Hughes. Now, remember these days, again, Howard Hughes was active in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, in aerospace until 1957. He disappeared. He was drugged and kept in sound studios with Perrier water and chocolate bars, sitting on a toilet all day, incoherent, from 57 to 66, and then not seen again after 66. So as this is taking its muscles or organization, if he was a front for Hughes, and if Hughes is being drugged or seduced or getting ready to be literally kidnapped, this Hughes organization was pouring this money into these connections. And in this article, chapter from The Godfather, they linked him not only to Hughes, but it said other rumors were more ominous. Gossip linked him with the Mafia. Well, Hughes and the Mafia aren't very far apart. Robert Mayu, using the Hughes organization from 1960 on, was combined for the Central Intelligence Agency with Carlos Marcello, Fratriano, Gambino, the Rosselli, the entire organized crime group from Vegas, New York, were working, Sam Giancana, were working with the CIA, with Howard Hughes organization, and the Mafia. So he asked the question, Brian Rostron in the Village Voice, was the rumor right that the money came for Hughes, or more ominous, the Mafia, but doesn't make the connections that Hughes, Mafia, CIA are one. And if I have to repeat that over and over again, maybe when you see these articles you will begin to realize that, because he goes on to quote Sindona, who was saying that 90% of all the money I use is someone else's. Now, Sindona is very much like William Taub. There's a Yiddish word called a schlepper. A nicer word around Hollywood or in the intelligence system is a gopher. Go for this, go for that, do this or that. Another word is the bag man. But they're even more important than that, because these men like Taub and Sindona sit at the pillars of power. They move in and out with the highest corporations and boardrooms and with the lowest hoodlums, and they weave. Their life is woven around millions and billions they're handling in strange banks with strange people, but always the same names and the same organizations. That's why the connection of the Taub book that I finished last week and the Village Voice article coming this week are so important. Now, they talk about the famous patrons in the portfolio. This is the Village Voice article that Mr. Sindona had, and his most famous patron was the Vatican, that he had the portfolio for $2 billion of their securities, and he took over Milan's Banca Unione. First he took that, then other major banks, and he worked with the Vatican and began to take the investment of some of the money that they had that was going to be taxed in, it was a lump sum given to them by Mussolini to stay neutral during World War II. They were given land and utilities and power companies, waterworks, and so forth. They were to give this money to Mr. Sindona to make his international banking connections. They had problems with, in quotes, the left. The worst they had was that Mr. Feltrinelli, and then he was a publisher in Milan, and then he mysteriously died. And as I said before, quoted from this article, the Vatican was grateful to be relieved of him. And then they were making investments all over the world, and of course one of their most famous pieces of property, which they own totally, is the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The large holdings of the Vatican are called the Societe Generale Immobiliare. I have that described November 24th, 1978. That's tape 364 about the property, the Vatican money that was to become diversified. They bought the Rome in the Hilton Hotel, the Pan Am building, the Champs-Élysées, and so forth. They took a lot of that money and dumped a lot of it on the stock exchange in Montreal, Canada. I received a sheet from a financial publication. One of the subscribers from the tape sends me these financial reports, and there's an article about silver. I don't know if this is the rough report or not. It has the date here, early January 1980. When you send me articles, put the date and the name of the publication so I'll be able to give it credit exactly where it came from. But in this particular article, it's a story of the silver market going up and down and how the early market was bounced around. And it goes into a story that the Rothschild Bank apparently made some pretty big loans to Michael Sindona, or Michele Sindona, depending how you pronounce it, of Franklin National Bank fame. And Mr. Sindona, somewhere along the line, managed to acquire 80 million ounces of silver. Obviously, he hadn't been holding it very long, or he wouldn't have gotten into trouble. In any event, the Rothschild Bank, either by calling in the loans or simply getting the silver from Sindona, in some way was able to dump it onto the market, and of course the prices tumbled. And at the same time we stopped buying silver, Mr. Hunt from Texas stopped buying, and the recession began to make itself felt. This goes into the connection of the Rothschild Bank to Michele Sindona, their endless connections of power and power people and manipulation of the market that are linked to this man and to the Vatican. Now, Sindona became the great papal financial advisor, and by 1974, the Vatican had lost $45 million. The Pope recently said to his group of cardinals that he got together when he came home from the United States that the Vatican had lost $90 million. And again, I repeat on purpose, did this money go into other causes? And they're saying they, in quotes, lost it. It really would be hard for the Vatican with blue chip stocks going up, and all they're buying is blue chip stocks and investments of gold and silver. It's really hard to see how they could lose that money unless people were in a position to say, take it out. And maybe Mr. Sindona didn't lose $45 million for the Franklin National Bank. Maybe it went into other causes, and they're asking the question, where did it go? Maybe if they look a little further, they'll find that it did indeed have a route and wasn't completely lost. Sindona came to the United States in 1971. That was just in time for the Bennett offices, the Mullen offices, to be opened in Washington, D.C. for the re-election of the president in 1972. This article talks about the offer of $1 million to Maurice Stans and Richard Nixon. I had also put that on a tape in November of 78, the time of Watergate and the elections of the president at the Vatican through Mr. Sindona was offering $1 million cash to Maurice Stans, who also lived at the Watergate hotel. And this Village Voice article goes into the promotion of Mr. Sindona speaking at various organizations, lectures at Columbia University, and as a famous financier, he was quite respectable going around the country. He set up deals in Chicago, Illinois, through a Oxford Electric Company, Long Island, the Interphoto Corporation, Pittsburgh, the Seaport Corporation, Auto Parts, Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Argus Corporation for optical equipment and cameras, and Argus controls Canada's Seaway hotel chains. According to these stories, again, Sindona didn't do well, and he began to lose money. He used to buy cheap, build up, and then sell. And according to the story, he's under arrest because as he began to lose from one place, he'd pull it in from another bank that he controlled to cover those losses. And then they would swing it to the other bank, and he kept taking from one to the other and moving it around until it finally caught up with him. The few businesses that he bought that went under, he covered by moving the money around, and eventually they found that some of these places were missing money that he was putting into losing businesses. Now, Sindona had one trouble. He said the Security Exchange Commission got on him and wanted to know whose money it was. And he said they were perfectly respectable people, but they don't want to say where their money's coming from. They tried to pin who was investing all this money with Sindona, that he was moving around as an international banker. Then he got the chairman of Franklin National Bank in trouble. He took over that bank, and the people working for him began to cover some of his manipulations of his investments, his selling off. And I won't go into all the details of it. The main point is that he tried to merge various banks and companies and cover losses and investments, always concealing how he got started and where his money really came from. This character, I can't believe, will go to jail. He knows too much, and he's too much linked to the Vatican. They'll probably put him on a lot of probation. In January 74, just when his bank in New York was going under for $45 million, he was entertained by the American Club of Rome, and John Volpe, U.S. ambassador to Italy, who came back for a cabinet position in the United States, presented Sindona as the man of the year, as a great figure, as a financial investment broker doing such a wonderful job. In 1967, Interpol informed the Italian police that they had information, they said it was unverified, but nobody bothered to verify it, of illicit movement of depressants, drugs, stimulants, and hallucinogenic drugs going from Italy, between Italy and the United States and possibly other European countries. This is in 1967, and this was just when the anti-war movement was going, the protesters, the hippies, the rock music starting out, and drugs were flooding the streets. And one of the four people named among the narcotics and stimulants and hallucinogenic drugs like LSD and so forth was Michele Sindona. Interpol and, of course, Nixon did nothing about that, but in 1967, Interpol had informed the Italian police of this. Sindona was also linked with black money. That's known in the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as assassination money. Interpol and newspapers in Italy linked him with black money, usually associated with murders and profits of organized crime. And this hidden money that Sindona traveled with, as I say, is important because he was selected by the Pope to make the investments for this Pope, Montini, who also worked with the Nazi mafia that were down in South America, gun-running, organized crime, and Montini was in the OSS. Later, the CIA, a Pope actually in the OSS, and Sindona, his bagman, was linked to depressants, hallucinogenic drugs, stimulants, and black money. Also, this article in the Village Voice refers to Sindona and the mafia, that Carlo Bordini, who was Sindona's right-hand man, when he pleaded guilty to bank fraud, told the Italian newspapers Michele Sindona was and still is one of the mafia bankers, the route through which organized crime money passes across the Atlantic. Here's a man working with Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Chase Manhattan, the General Motors, the Watergate, Pan Am, all of these major corporations, and linked to money and drugs traffic from Europe to the United States and back and forth. As I said earlier, Sindona was reported by ABC reporter Jack Bagan in Italy as having hot dollars tied to mobsters, illegal investment channels, and so forth. Now, finally, in this article, there's a subject which is dear to my heart that I briefly mentioned, and I'll close with that. He suggested a 1957 Mafia Summit meeting at the Grand Hotel de Palm in Palermo, Italy, and Brian Roston, who wrote the article, said this is where the reorganization of the mob financiers took place, and he clearly implied that Sindona was their banker for their hot dollars, that Michele Sindona was the banker for hot dollars, and the meeting in 1957 of the Mafia Summit was in Palermo, Italy. As I said before, this was written up in the Gemstone Files by Bruce Roberts. Many of you have it. It's important date. The Appalachian meeting in New York City with the American mobsters that met that identical year that they were meeting in Palermo. They were meeting in the Appalachia area, and they decided that instead of fighting each other in the United States, breaking each other's turf or breaking each other's backs, that they would divide the United States into different sections and work together. And then in 1957 is when the Hughes organization began to take over the body of Howard Hughes, and the neo-Nazi and the Nazi movement with NASA, the space satellites, the communications, the CIA, the drug market, put Howard Hughes from 1957 to 1966 into a stupor in and out of the dining room of the Beverly Hills Hotel or the studios, where people could see that he was loony, drugged, crazy, thin, off his rocker. So by 1966, Howard Hughes was put on that train with CIA agents and John Rosselli of organized crime and taken away. Mr. Taub said he never saw Hughes after 66. He doesn't ask why, and you can bet your bottom dollar why, but he was taken to Boston, again the home of Robert Mayu and a lot of the assassination teams, and these tapes are played in Boston now. This was a hub of activity for the treatment of where Howard Hughes was given whatever it was. They brought a doctor from Florida, and after that, Hughes was never physically really seen again. He had many doubles, but not Howard Hughes. At the end of the line, for all purposes, for the man historically known as Howard Hughes, was Boston in 1966. Then a body came back on a train dark of night, moved into Vegas, picked up this money, and this article in the Village Voice goes on to say that a lot of the money for Sindona comes from the United States investments, from mafia skimming money in the United States, and that indeed would be true if he was linked to the Hughes organization to Vegas as the bag man. Now, as I say, all this missing money that he's charged with may not actually be missing. It may have been deployed to other places, and I'm sure that will never come out. He'll be charged with missing money, but it's a wonderful way for the mobster or the CIA to allocate themselves $45 million at the expense of Franklin National Bank or other banks in Italy and use it for other purposes, which multiplies the amount of weapons they can buy from a man like Mr. Cummings in England with his 40 million rounds of ammunition. In other words, they can arm private armies with this amount of money and keep buying weapons until the whole world is armed, which was the goal of the Minutemen. They have arms and armies every 20 miles apart across the entire United States. My time is up, and these are broad concepts, but if you have the tapes, you can play them over and over, and if you hear it on the radio, you can order the cassettes. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.